Okay, I'll go ahead and start with the introductions. I want to welcome everybody here to the second to last seminar in the SEFS seminar series here in Autumn Quarter. Thanks for joining us on a sunny day here in Seattle, wherever you may be. I recognize that we're all maybe in different places, but I want to take a moment to acknowledge that where we are is the SEFS sort of on main campus is on the land that touches the shared waters of all the tribes and bands of the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. And one of the things that means for us is that the work we do is important in sort of managing and understanding resource management approaches. It's important for us to engage with Native communities as we do our work. And I think this talk is an interesting partnership, represents an interesting partnerships, gives us a window into work that is going on within SEFS. Courtney Bobsin is a third-year PhD student. Yeah, did the math right. Third-year PhD student in SEFS, having completed a master's in SEFS as well, working out with the Olympic Natural Resource Center in Forks and some of the tribes out there. And I asked her to come and sort of represent some of that work and also to help. This quarter, we've been doing some more conversational kinds of presentations that are really helpful to see how people are working together. And in this case, Courtney's invited Tim Vredenburg, who's, hopefully I said that right, works with the Cow Creek Band of the Umpqua Nation out of Roseburg, Oregon. And I don't have the title, sorry. Can you say what your title is? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm the tribe's director of forest management.
Thank you, thank you. Tim is the Umpqua Tribe's Director of Forest Management, and we're very glad to have you here and to hear about the relationship and partnership and co-production of science between SEFS and Umpqua Tribe. So thanks to both of you for being here, and I look forward to the talk. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Dan. I am going to share my screen. Just give me one moment. So I believe you're seeing the presenter view of the screen now. All right. All right. Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Dan. And for everyone who is on the line today listening to the presentation put together by myself and by my colleague, Tim, on lands management and tribal engagement. So I will kick us off with some slides and some presentation material, and then I'll pass it off to Tim to talk more about lands management from his perspective. All right, so I know Dan had done a land acknowledgement, but it never hurts to say it one more time. So I'll say that we acknowledge that all of our homes and institutions exist on Indigenous land. UW Seattle campus sits on the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, Duwamish, and Muckleshoot nations. And the Olympic Natural Resources Center, where I do research and work, sits on the ancestral lands of the Quileute and Ho nations. So there are 574 federally recognized tribes in the US, and 29 of these tribal nations reside in present-day Washington state, but have been living on this land since time immemorial. And in addition, there are tribes that are not federally recognized whose historical and ancestral lands are here, an example being the Duwamish tribe. And as you can imagine, each of these tribes are distinct from one another, and there is never a one-size-fits-all approach to tribal engagement because they are each sovereign nations with different perspectives and needs and cultures. I'll talk about engagement from a non-tribal and university perspective, and then my colleague, Tim, will present on lands management and his work in tribal forest management with the Cow Creek. So I wanted to start the presentation by highlighting just a couple of key concepts to tribal engagement that should be considered and used when working with tribal partners, and especially when starting a new partnership. And these are best practices that we use and follow at the Olympic Natural Resources Center where I work and do my research. So the first is using a government-to-government process when building a relationship with a tribe. Because tribes are sovereign nations, meaning that they have their own government that functions as a federal government and a right to self-govern, it's important to approach the leaders of the tribe, which are typically a tribal council, although not always. And this is referred to as kind of going in the front door, or not sidestepping leadership and approaching a department within a tribe, but first, before anything else, requesting to meet with the tribal council. And as I said before, there's not one single approach to tribal engagement. There's certainly both formal and informal relationships that can be created. And while one tribe might want a government-to-government process to happen, at another tribe, it might be appropriate to build a relationship with the tribal department through a mutual contact, like Tim and I have been doing. There are a number of different trainings and resources that discuss best practices when working with tribes, and I'll mention just a couple of them here that I found useful, but know that there are certainly many more. First, I'll highlight a really excellent training on government-to-government relationship building hosted by the Governor's Office of Indian Affairs at the state level. Unfortunately, it's not currently being offered due to COVID, but once it resumes, it's a really good resource to check out. And for more at home, for UW folks, the American Indian Studies Department offers classes and hosts seminars and symposiums, like the Living Breath Symposium put on annually. And the Evans School offers a class called Native Nations, Native Lands, Native Waters that is really terrific. UW's Earth Lab hosts seminar series focused on environmental justice work and tribal sovereignty that you could check out. And lastly, a really important resource and topic to learn about that informs a lot of what I do is on free, prior, and informed consent. And I thought it'd be worth it to spend a little bit of time talking about that now. So the United Nations developed a manual for ethically working with tribes and indigenous people using this free, prior, and informed consent. And at the core of this is indigenous people's right to self-determination, or their right to their own cultural, social, and economic development. And this is a tool for those working with indigenous peoples and tribes on any project or partnership to ensure that they are using the best practices in an equitable way. And in this manual, the UN highlights that indigenous peoples have the right to give or withhold their consent to a project and are able to change that decision at any time throughout the partnership and relationship. They also have the right to negotiate the conditions of a project, how it's implemented, how it's monitored and studied, and how it goes forward. And this is a process where indigenous people are able to have their own decision-making processes when projects inherently impact and affect their livelihoods, their rights, as well as their natural resources, their culture, or their knowledge. So in this manual, free means that they can voluntarily give their consent without any pressure or manipulation to do so. Prior refers to the engagement that's happening in advance with plenty of time for consideration on the tribe's part. Informed, meaning that all information was provided in a clear and culturally appropriate way. And consent, meaning that there was a formal decision-making process that could happen to provide that consent. This figure on the right-hand side highlights some examples of different ways that free, prior, and informed consent could be implemented. So I'll highlight just a couple. The first being adopt social, cultural, or religious-friendly processes. A second, create a fair, non-intimidating, and encouraging environment. And lastly, unconditional acceptance and regards for community. So you see more and more on this slide, and there's more beyond this. But these are just a handful of different things to consider when building a relationship and using free, prior, and informed consent. And within this manual, they also have provided a checklist to ensure that all field projects are using this free, prior, and informed consent. And as a department that does a lot of field work and field projects, I wanted to just mention a couple of them that I find useful. So the first one is, does the project staff have the knowledge and competence to work with Indigenous peoples in a culturally appropriate manner? And has the project staff been trained on how to interact with Indigenous peoples? A second example is, have the involved communities had sufficient time to get expert advice on the project? Have sufficient resources been facilitated for them to get expert advice on the project? So again, these are just a handful of different items in this longer checklist that you can check out on the UN's website. So having touched on some kind of key principles to tribal engagement, knowing that this is a very much a Reader's Digest version of it, I wanted to highlight an example from my work and my research. So I work and I'm a student with the Olympic Natural Resources Center, or ONRC, which is a UW and SEFS facility located in Forks, Washington, on the west end of the Olympic Peninsula. ONRC has been developing relationships and collaborating with coastal tribes for 2 decades. And we have a few key programs that work directly with tribes, and I'll highlight a couple of them here. In addition, ONRC also offers a neutral location for tribes in the region to meet with one another in a private room at the ONRC facility, in another way that we collaborate. So first, we have the Olympic Region Harmful Algal Blooms Project, or the ORHAB program. It was created in 1999 to collect data, monitor, and analyze potential harmful algal blooms that are impacting shellfish on the Olympic Peninsula coast. This is a natural resource that's really important to local people, including tribal members. And it's a partnership between UW's ONRC, as well as the 4 coastal tribes, the Quinault, Hoh, Quileute, and Makah. In addition, the Washington Department of Health, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and so many more beyond that. Researchers and staff members from ONRC are really directly involved in this partnership in its day-to-day operations. We also have the North Pacific Coast Lead Entity, or NPICL program. It's a collaboration between UW's ONRC, many different tribes in the region beyond the coastal tribes, the city of Forks, and Cullom and Jefferson counties. And this has a goal of improving the habitat and genetic diversity for salmonid species in the region. Frank Hansen from ONRC, who's on the line, is the lead entity coordinator, and is also really at the driving force behind ONRC's tribal engagement strategy, as a former teacher and a superintendent of the Quileute Tribal School for over 25 years prior to coming to ONRC. And finally, we have the Ethnoforestry Project. It's one of our terrestrial and forest-based projects that we collaborate and partner with tribes in the region on. And I'll use this as an example of our approach to tribal engagement. So the Ethnoforestry Project really started from conversations with tribal elders and leaders. In 2017, there was a canoe dedication ceremony where a Hoh tribal elder was receiving her family's canoe from a public garden in Sequim and was donating it to ONRC as a way to strengthen the cultural connections between the tribe and UW. And at the ceremony, she was talking to ONRC's director and my advisor, Bernard Borman, and explained to him that she had watched the availability and the abundance of beargrass, which is a really key basket weaving plant species for tribal members. She had watched it really decline over the course of her lifetime. And she was recreating baskets from her tribe that she had seen in the Burke Museum, but was having difficulty finding the material that she needed for these projects. And as we talked to other folks in the area, this was a really common sentiment. Plant species that were once fairly available were becoming harder and harder to find and to use. And that really struck Bernard and I and led us to wonder if there were other ways to manage public lands that could better meet the needs of local people and really enhance well-being, especially for tribal people who have a legal right to their ceded land, much of which exists on current public lands. And while the well-being and the livelihood of local people are connected to public lands management, they traditionally give very little say in how that land is managed. So through this project, we're trying out new land management strategies where plants that have cultural or personal value to local communities are actively grown alongside our timber trees in our managed forests to create more plant availability for local communities. Typically, public lands managers will grow timber species and try to exclude any competition. They're not actively managing for things like cultural resources, wildlife, or ecosystem services beyond timber. We're studying how we can change the system to benefit ecosystems as a whole that include people. So when this project was just an idea, our first step was to meet with the tribal councils of local tribes to discuss the project and receive any initial thoughts and feedback on it. And due to the capacity of staff and myself, we started with the Quileute and Ho tribes, and we'll hopefully be expanding that in the coming years. So starting in 2017, we met with the tribal council to discuss the project, its goals, the concept, and really to receive their input and what they thought about it. And we regularly went back to meet with the council, and with their permission started also working with the natural resources departments in both the Quileute and Ho tribes. So through these initial conversations with folks, we started developing ideas for this project, and we called it ethnoforestry, or using knowledge and input from local people and applying it to the forest management process. This project proposes really new approaches to forest management and has two key elements that we're actively engaging with tribes on through community interviews as well as through a field study. And I'll go into a little bit of detail on both of them. So we determined that the best way to understand what local communities need from their public lands would be to ask them through this process of community interviews. So we went back to the Quileute and Ho tribal councils and proposed our idea for interviewing tribal members in order to really better understand how public lands management can better meet their needs and if it's really tied to well-being. And if they've seen any changes in the availability of plants that they would like to harvest over the course of their lifetime or over the course of the time they've spent in the region. And as they considered this request, we went back and developed a list of questions that they were welcome to change or reject, and we would alter it accordingly. And we presented it to them at another council meeting. And we also discussed things like data collection, sharing, analysis, how publishing the information would work. And in using free, prior, and informed consent, the tribes were able to determine what kind of agreements they wanted to use, and we were happy to do anything that they were happy with and wanted to do. And they could take as long as they needed for this decision-making process to happen. So in September of 2019, we received approval through the Institutional Review Board, or IRB, for working with human subjects. And we waited to get approval from the tribal council before doing any interviewing on our part. So over late spring 2020 to early summer, we received approval, and we started in August of 2020 to begin working with a point person at the Quileute tribe who helped coordinate interviews, interviewees, and times and dates and things like that. Due to COVID, each interview has been over the phone and one-on-one, and will probably continue to be that way for quite a while. And we've been focused right now on interviewing Quileute tribal members and some Ho tribal members as well. So there are already many different key themes that are emerging through these interviews, especially around issues of access. many people, even prior to this project, have noted that there are often locked gates that are blocking access to public and ceded lands. So, and ceded lands are lands that were ceded when the treaties were signed, but the rights to hunt, fish, and gather on those lands were not ceded. And in addition, once folks got to an area, if they were able to get past a locked gate when they got to the area, there were often not plans that they wanted to see or wanted to use. And it has really highlighted these two levels of a lack of access. A lack of physical access to get to a site, and then a secondary lack of access of not having the plant materials they wanted to see there once they got there. And in addition, the continued parceling of land on the Olympic Peninsula has meant that more and more ceded land is really inaccessible due to private ownership. So as an example, Washington DNR, Department of Natural Resources, has lands that over time have become almost like islands of these public land areas and are surrounded by private landowners, whether that's an individual or say a private timber company. Accessing those DNR parcels are now harder and harder as the roads that lead to them are private roads and there's private gates on those roads. So this continuing of parceling the land base has also impacted ceded land accessibility. So through this, local people have brought up so many innovative and simple ideas that could really be accomplished and help push the needle, and things that we would not have known or really thought of without their direct feedback. An example someone gave was DNR could have multiple tribal liaisons that are region by region, so tribes could work with a regional tribal liaison instead of just one for the state. Things that are really straightforward and rather simple to meet their needs. We are still in the interviewing process, but once it's complete and our analysis is done, we'll go back to the tribal council and we'll present our findings and talk to them about next steps for publishing and things like that. And nothing will go forward without their review and approval and consent on it. So a second part of this work is creating an ethnoforestry field study. This will evaluate ways to grow valuable understory plants along with timber trees to enhance the availability of plant material for local people, but also to provide food for wildlife from pollinators to ungulates, and also manage our timberlands in a new way. We started implementing field trials on a DNR site between Forks and La Push on the coast in a recently harvested unit that's about 100 acres, and you can see it highlighted here in purple. And it's roughly in this kind of red square area between Forks and La Push. From the development of the study plan, we have been keeping the Tribal and Natural Resources departments from the Quileute and Hoh tribes in the loop. They were able to offer any input and feedback and add research questions to the proposed plan to ensure that any question that would be helpful and relevant to the tribes would be addressed through this field study. I won't go into specifics of the study, but I'm happy to answer questions later about it if they come up. So through this process, this has really generated really fascinating conversations and partnerships, including a really awesome discussion with one of the Quileute Natural Resource Department staff members who is starting a restoration project on the reservation where they're going to be planting understory plants that are valuable to tribal members. And it's been a really great exchange back and forth of resources and things like that have really stemmed from these conversations that we've already been building over time. So conclusions from both the community interviews and the field study will be scaled up in the coming years as part of a long-term integrated management study, or we call it a T3 study, on the coast. This is an adaptive management study and a partnership between DNR and ONRC. And we'll be creating management scale treatments to study these ethnoforestry treatments at a different and a landscape level. So all of the information that we're gaining through these interviews and the field trial will be scaled up in the coming years. And as we move forward, the directors of natural resources for both the Hoh and the Quileute tribe will be reviewing the study plans to make any comments or discuss any changes on that front. The ethnoforestry project is an example of using a learning-based collaboration approach to lands management. Learning-based collaboration is a methodology that really highlights the need for learning to be a key element in the collaboration process. Managers, community leaders, and stakeholders are all involved in the research development and are learning from one another through this process. And while it derives from several different disciplines like adaptive management, it differs in that it really emphasizes that learning should be occurring really between all parties, between managers and stakeholders and tribal nations and anyone involved. Learning should be happening about the process itself, as well as from the results of the studies or research that's being conducted. It emphasizes the benefit of sharing knowledge and expertise with one another in order to inform these research studies. A few key elements of learning-based collaboration include things like a bottom-up management process or having stakeholders included in the management design and implementation of those studies. So through this work, we have seen that while we may have our own Western viewpoints on lands management, our tribal partners have really place-based knowledge and have creative and innovative ideas for management. And through this collaboration, we've already learned so much on how public lands management could be changed to achieve ecosystem well-being in the region. Many tribes have their own traditional ecological knowledge when managing their land for their natural resources. The Ethnoforestry Project is a way to approach public lands management, but this concept of managing for more than just timber is not new to many tribal nations and tribal groups. The Intertribal Timber Council and the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission are made up of dozens of tribes throughout the region and address issues facing many of these different tribes around resource management and use this traditional knowledge when making those management decisions. In addition, there are so many examples of tribes using traditional knowledge to manage resources. Just two examples would be the Muckleshoot Food Sovereignty Project that was created in 2010 and has included them buying back ancestral and ceded land to promote important cultural foods. And another example would be the burning of Moses Prairie by the Quinault Indian Nation. This was a historic prairie that was suffering from forest encroachment and was historically managed with fire by the tribe. So in 2016, the tribe burned the prairie for the first time in well over a century to bring back fire into that ecosystem. These are just two examples of many, many, many more. Tribes have been managing reservation land using their traditional knowledge and philosophy that is not often taught in universities. And I think we could all benefit from their really unique perspective on this. So with that, I just want to thank some folks. The collaboration between Washington DNR and us have been really wonderful, and I want to thank them, as well as our partnership and collaboration we've developed with the Quileute Nation and the Hoh as well. It's been really fantastic, as well as our funding agencies, Campus Sustainability Fund and UW's Earth Lab program. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Tim Vredenburg, Director of Forest Management with the Cow Creek, to talk about tribal conservation, management, and engagement from his perspective. Thanks so much.
Thanks. I'm not quite as tech savvy as Courtney. Hey, I did it. I appreciate that, and I've really enjoyed the time getting to work with Bernard and Courtney on this project, and want to give a special shout out to Gary Morishima. I saw on the participants list, one of my heroes in tribal forest management in the Northwest. Appreciate, Dan, you arranging this for us. For my part, I wanted to share some of my experience working for tribes over the last 20 years, and it, definitely approach this with a lot of humility and always being careful. Courtney touched on this, that there are there are shared values, shared commonality between tribes, but really one of the most important lessons I've learned is that every single tribe is its own independent sovereign, and 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 we need to always be careful not to paint tribes with a broad brush approach. So I wanted to share some of my perspective as the Cow Creek Forest manager, and I'm struck working in this area with tribal members that as we travel across their forests and their homelands, that their stories, their burial plots, food gathering places that really span the whole area, that span watersheds, and across elevations and seasonality, that really every single acre that we occupy now as a modern society was at one time important for hunting and gathering their food and shelter resources. Today, the Cow Creek remain dependent on their forest, dependent in a economic self-sufficiency manner. The revenue they're able to develop through forest management is important to fund education programs, health initiatives, the taking care of the tribal eldership, really going back to people. Just I don't want to say just as important, maybe some people more, is the hunting and gathering aspect. That is still such a very passionate part of who the Cow Creek are, in terms of using the forest lands and really reconnecting and maintaining that intimate connection with those lands through activities like hunting that transcend just the capture of meat, but it's the community dynamic that exists within that. I wanted to share some of the perspectives from Indian Forest Management Assessment Team. Every 10 years, there's a scientific team that conducts an assessment of Indian forest management. And I wanted to share some of the observations from IFMAT 3. One was that the management of Indian forest lands must be directed towards achieving a dynamic set of tribal objectives. Thus, a tribal vision for their forest is a critical component of effective management, planning, implementation, and self-governance. Also noting that tribal members typically express a holistic view of the forest and have consistently articulated the primary importance of caring for the forest and managing it in an integrated fashion. That really, there's a lot loaded in that last statement for me, as I have observed the tribal approach to planning that I've been able to participate in, coming from a more federal or system of planning where it's more interdisciplinary, and that tends to work, but sometimes falls apart when those interdisciplinary components come to the table, and it's more of a negotiation over different sets of values, competing values, and what comes out the other end. It's more like a sausage making process. What I've experienced in a tribal planning process is this integrated fashion that the IFMAT report observed, where the tribal leadership really defines the vision through their values, and then their resource team is then, you know, through an integrated approach, where it's a shared responsibility between the different disciplines to accomplish the vision and outcomes of the leadership. It creates a different dynamic, I've noticed. And then there's a quote, I got to read this one too, is, oh shoot, oh good. If we're not maintaining our forests, then it's a reflection on how we're living our lives. I love that quote from a focus group participant. There's always, in every decision, in every project, three critical components. And this is, you know, this is in our forest management setting. Obviously, there are different different kinds of management that wouldn't have an economic component, but in our forest management planning, there's always there has to be some, even in our non-commercial activities, some form of economic that either funds a project or provides those necessary revenues for self-sufficiency. The ecological aspect, making sure that we are responsibly considering the variety of ecosystems and how the tribal membership and our activities are fitting within those ecologies, and then really the tribe's culture and that social component is a thread that weaves through every single project. Again, you know, noting differences as I've you know, participated in federal planning and forest management, is at the top of the list, as I noted before, and more of an integrated approach to planning, which I guess I would contrast with, you know, a strict, you know, interdisciplinary approach. For the Cow Creek, it's a continuous management in both space and time, spanning the entire forest, meaning that management isn't siloed in specific areas, that you know, this area will be managed for this and this area will be managed for that, or areas are set aside and delayed. For Cow Creek, it's you know, they're attempting to have this continuous management across their whole forest. Adaptation is a critical underpinning of their whole strategy, as we're, you know, approaching, you know, different dynamics now in climate and varying strategies of tribal neighbors, that in a constant approach to learning, that as we're implementing projects, we're doing monitoring and then feeding that monitoring output back into our next set of decisions. I touched on this a little in the second, is maintaining diverse forest cover continuously over time. That for Cow Creek is ensuring there's always a diversity of habitats, that we're not managing on we're not man we're not observing one forest type across the ownership. The tribe wants to maintain a healthy and robust early cereal community of forest, where deer forage is healthy and abundant, and elk um, uh, can be accommodated, as well as the native plants that are important for gathering and supporting important species. Um, in our neighborhood in Southwest Oregon, the tribe has to be proactive in prevention measures, reducing their risk of wildfire, both on reservation, but an even greater concern is the risk of the spread of wildfire from our neighbors to the tribal reservation lands. And then another interesting, I guess, kind of dynamic that I've observed in the Cow Creek's approach to management is that all of our treatments tend to serve all of the values in some measure, some proportion. Again, it's not their forest lands aren't siloed into segregated land use allocations that are dedicated for a specific purpose, and then those projects that exist or occur on those areas are for specific value fulfillment. Every project is intended in some way to support and serve the tribe's full set of values in some proportion. And again, I keep mentioning this, I notice I put it in there twice now: adaptive. We really feel like we have to be sensitive to the outcomes of the decisions that are being made, and correcting or changing and move as we move forward. I'm just going to zip through a few pictures that kind of that I took, that I kind of felt like were representative of forest management projects that we've been doing lately. You'll notice there tends to be scattered retention. There tends to be openings, a variety of different habitats. As we look at our approach to conservation and management, we're looking at this as an indigenous approach to conservation and management, and I really have, again, contrasting that with my training. Initially, I would describe more from a Western background, that we do create land use allocations that are segregated, siloed, and with the intention of protecting specific resources. As I've worked with tribes, I've learned that the approach to conservation is a little bit different. A tribal vision for the forest is developed, again, through tribal leadership, tribal councils, and the membership, and that vision is based on their values. Those values being hunting and gathering, economic self-sufficiency, water and fisheries. for the Cow Creek, they've coined the term a reservation without reserves, though. All lands are managed to fulfill tribal values. So when something is deemed special, that value is managed for, as opposed to that area being segregated for a specific kind of management or reserve to protect that thing. And I'll talk more about that a little later. I wanted to provide a little bit of context or an example of a project that we did just a little while ago. This was a meadow restoration area. The purpose of the project was to protect and maintain or enhance a system of naturally occurring ridgetop prairie meadows. This is a picture of one of these meadows that this picture was taken in 1939. At this time, it was about 30 acres. 27 years later, noticing fire exclusion, it's delineated at about half the size, and then obviously continues to shrink over time until today. That same meadow is about 4 acres. The obviously the meadows were maintained for a very, very long time through management, through traditional burning. At this point, we couldn't just reintroduce fire. We had to go through the process of removing the conifer trees, the islands, the large stem conifers from the meadow margins, and then of course reapplying fire to these areas is such a critical and important tool to those ecologies. And so just some fun pictures that I wanted to share of that project. You'll notice we had a harvest area near and around this meadow margin, and then also we're able to burn the meadow as well. What we didn't do, see, this is my attempt at humor. It's a picture of nothing. What we didn't do was nothing. We didn't buffer it. We didn't leave it alone. The tribe managed for those values that were important to them, and these meadows are very important to them for a host of reasons, for hunting, elk especially, and then also gathering huckleberry. It's easier to define what indigenous conservation is not. It's not a hands-off approach as I've observed it. And it's not as the Cow Creek are applying it, it's not a system of reserves and buffers where we draw lines on a map and we remove management from those areas. Just on the contrary, when something is deemed important, that value that is important is managed for. I don't know, call it interactive management. It's associated, it's mutual, it's interdependent. It recognizes the role of people in those ecologies, in those landscapes. I learned this lesson, or began learning it, from a tribal elder early in my career as I approached a forest thinning project. And in the middle of my forest thinning project, there was a meadow that I knew had that was sacred and had a really important spiritual component. It was a place that tribal members went to do vision questing, and I wanted to make sure to protect that. So I applied a healthy buffer around that meadow. Um, and I won't say exactly what this tribal elder said to me, because it might be a little too colorful um, for this setting. But in a nutshell, he said, "Hey, dummy, um, why did you cut out the meadow? You know, we should be managing to restore that meadow, not ignoring it." I was honestly blown away. My intention wasn't to ignore it. My intention was to protect it. As at the time, I saw myself more as a biologist with an environmental science degree, and I wanted to protect these special places, and the best way I knew how to protect something was to draw a line around it and not disturb it. And when in fact, that was exactly what he uh, that he wanted us doing. Um, Another time, he said, by this time I must have been dressing more like a forester, and he said, "You damn foresters are all alike. You stand on the ridge tops and you look down at the streams and the rivers." He said, "That's where we lived." He said, that's where we gathered. That's where we should be managing, and you put these big buffers around it, and all of the plants that we depended on are choked out. It was such a juxtaposition for me early in my career that really jolted my thinking in terms of how we might view conservation differently than the way that I had been trained to view it, through more of a Western lens. Even as we look at the breakdown of how our words were, English words were formulated. Forest, it's the root word is related to foreign. It was the idea that it was out there, and so as we attempt to protect things, in this neck of the woods, anyways, in Southwest Oregon, we're loving it to death in many cases, as we're watching some of our most beautiful and sacred areas that we've protected for a century just be ravaged by terrible wildfire that isn't good fire. It's catastrophic and frankly an environmental atrocity. Very much different than a proactive, interactive approach to conservation that chooses to manage for values. And then finally, I just wanted to touch on partnerships since we're together today. Partner. I don't think we can do this alone. Partnership with governments, with our neighbors, especially as in the West, where we observe checkerboard patterning of ownerships. We have to learn to work together, and then also partnerships with colleges and universities and tribes is, I think, a really special area that could be developed more. And as we look at those relationships, I think they have to be developed intentionally, uh, and rooted in humility, as uh, none of us knows it all, and but oftentimes are intimidated, too, by from coming from a tribal um, employment, I guess, position. It can be intimidating to work with university folks, not necessarily knowing who to talk to about what, or where to go, and knowing they're um, super smart people that are the experts in a certain area. But at the same time, it's that, it's important to recognize on the tribal side that special knowledge, and have humility in that as well. The best kinds of relationships I've had with friends in universities is when we're able to have honest and vulnerable conversations, that are personal in nature. And then every successful relationship requires effort and skin in the game, um, and should be reciprocal. I think there's a lot to be gained, from this kind of relationship between tribes and universities, um, that it can help us collectively ask different kinds of questions, um, and find different outcomes, as tribes, um, really are it's the outcome that matters so much. They do have to live with the outcomes of their decisions, and so that testing and outcome driven management, I think, provides sometimes a different slant on the kinds of questions we're asking and the kind of testing we're doing, and then providing data driven adaptation that is critical to tribal communities. It's critical to non-tribal surrounding communities as well, that can provide for us a shared learning and opportunity to grow. So with that, Dan, I guess I would yield the microphone.
Thank you. Thanks to both of you for a really interesting look into the opportunities and challenges in engagement, and some learning about the goals of land management within the varied tribal contexts. We do have a couple of questions on here that popped up when Courtney was talking, that had to do with a little bit more details about your work on the Olympic Peninsula. I'll maybe relay these to you while asking if others have questions. Feel free to shoot the questions in chat or in the Q&A. I don't know if you see those, Courtney, but they're from Tom Hinckley, asking about whether you had any burn plots in your DNR study site. Did you interview with elders? And then there's an individual he names, I don't know who that is, but you can maybe respond to that.
Sure. Thanks, Tom, for your question. On the DNR site, there will not be any burn plots. We talked to DNR about potentially burning the site, but it just wasn't feasible with the timeline and the proximity to other forests nearby. So unfortunately, we tried to explore that avenue, but we will not have any burn plots on this particular smaller site. We are interviewing elders. I've interviewed a few already, and I'm sure I'll interview more as time goes on. They have been so extraordinary, and I feel like I think about them for days afterwards. They're like so profound, like so compelling and interesting, and people have been so gracious with their time, and I'm so grateful for that. And I haven't talked to Nancy Turner. That would be amazing. I follow her work pretty closely and really love all of her publications, but I don't know her personally. If you do, I would love that connection to be built if you happen to know her, Tom. Thanks for the question.
Fantastic. We have another question, maybe to both of you. Should the Northwest Forest Plan be revised to better account for tribal conservation and tribal needs?
I can share my perspective. While I think the Northwest Forest Plan provided a good timeout to allow us to recalibrate how we approach federal forest management. In my experience, I worked for a tribe that managed. They were the only tribe in the country that had to manage under the Northwest Forest Plan, and I can tell you there was a lot of tension in between the rigid reserve system nature of the Northwest Forest Plan and the tribe's desire to approach management more from a holistic approach to conservation, where we were managing for special values throughout those reserves, as opposed to that management being excluded from those areas. So at least the tribe that I work for found it very frustrating managing and practicing within the Northwest Forest Plan.
I'll just add a couple of things. What a big question. I would say that perhaps the Northwest Forest Plan thought about people as more of an afterthought, and the human dimension is not woven in as well as the management side is of lands. And I think that is an area for exploration, to think more about how people are interacting and using these public lands that are managed, and that would include tribal people, since a lot of their ceded lands exist on lands that are also following those protocols through the Northwest Forest Plan.
We have another question here. David Diaz relates that UW Earth Lab hosted a training earlier today, in fact, about how to formally engage with tribes in research and emphasize the importance of following formal protocols, which the tribes may have in place, including their own tribal IRBs. Can you describe how you have gone about establishing agreements to partner and collaborate on research?
Sure. I will tell you a little bit. I don't, not having explicit permission from the council to talk about this in this setting, I'll only say maybe a little bit. But yes, so we received approval through UW's IRB in September of 2019. And in this IRB, I specified that we would work with tribal councils individually, and whatever they were comfortable with, we would go with. So we met with the tribal councils and discussed if they wanted, if they had an IRB that we should be completing and how that process would go. So we had formal meetings with the tribal councils to establish what on our end we could do in addition to the IRB that had been approved. And I hope that's answering your question. But yes, we went down that pathway with both the Quileute and Ho tribes to make sure that that they were in the driver's seat, and whatever they wanted us to do to meet their requirements, we would absolutely do.
You have something to add, Tim?
Yeah, just also recognizing that every tribe is different and will have a different approach. It is always best to err on the side of being taking that more formal approach initially, to respect, tribal chairmanship and tribal council's leadership. Sometimes though, you may find you're quickly routed to a natural resource director or forest manager that will be able to develop that relationship more fully and then help navigate through the nuances of that individual tribe and how they want to approach partnership.
We're certainly beyond time, but there's such a rich question here. I'd hate to not ask it, so we'll ask one more question from Gary Morishima asks, one of the issues you touched upon is the contrast between different ways of knowing and transferring knowledge in academic, agency, and tribal environments. What are the main obstacles you've encountered, and how have you dealt with
them? Maybe I could start. I have definitely had hard conversations with folks that have a more Western and kind of like traditional forester kind of approach to forest management. I had a really interesting conversation just maybe a month ago with a forester who said, like, why are you trying to manage all that brush? Like when referencing like trying to manage for understory or other values, and it could lead to this interesting conversation, and has with a lot of our partners at DNR, of considering other knowledge forms and other possibilities. But we've definitely kind of butted up against a little bit of pushback from people who were trained in a particular way of forest management and are maybe not initially open to thinking about these alternative ways of managing on public lands. But I think that we've really slowly been pushing the needle from people who tended to have this particular viewpoint of like, we shouldn't be doing anything but timber, to exploring other ways to manage our systems.
Yeah, and I think it's finding the alignment with the questions that for us, that sharing of knowledge is an obstacle. I think for us is as we approach that, especially maybe within universities, is as we develop questions, who how those align with someone's area of interest or funding, and how we begin to engage and to answer those questions. There's another question, Dan, I can't resist either. It's really hard for me to.
Go ahead, that one's really good too.
It is good, and I'm here all night. The question is, how do you balance being proactive on all acres, not leaving buffers, and loving the land to death? It seems that the tribal approach is more intentionally active than conventional approach. So how do you know when there would be too much activity? And that's a really good question. That really the intention is people get scared when the tribe I work for talks about this reservation without reserves. It conjures up visions of these giant clear cuts. We're not with no buffers, you're not protecting streams, and that's really not it at all. In fact, it's the opposite. It requires a lot more intentionality, as you mentioned, that and a lot more work to get to know the area and to know it that you're going to be managing in, understanding the landscape. Is it deficient in hardwoods, or is it deficient in large wood? Is it temperature limited? And what aspect, and is it facing, and what are the slopes of it, and all of that information gathering would then guide how the tribe might approach managing in these areas. We call them our riparian areas, stream enhancement areas, and so with even in the nomenclature, the intention is to manage for that value of the stream that makes the stream so important to people, that cold water and fish that provide for the tribe, that but at times may be overcrowded because it was planted maybe in the 60s or 70s, and there's no daylight, maybe primary productivity is lacking, and creating an opening near a stream is allowed if that's in shortage. So it really does require a lot more effort, a lot more on the ground knowledge, and then that's why I think our monitoring and follow-up is so critical, is that it's going to help us guide our future decisions to know how good a job we're doing, or if we've made mistakes.
I think we could probably keep discussing, but given the time, I'm going to respect that we are out of time. Tom Hinckley has some comments here. Using the term convention, I'll give Tom the last word here. Using the term conventional approach already illustrates the dichotomy between different ways of knowing and the need to respect other ways of knowing. Place and time are so critical. If you have lived in a place forever, you know how the place behaves with time. So that's responding to your point there, Tim. So thank you both. This is a really wonderful conversation and window into the collaboration and the need for more of it. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks, everybody.